right, gang, let's dive right in here. We got our very first acquittal among the January 6th protesters in what's nothing less than a humiliating defeat for the Justice Department. A federal judge who is himself a Trump appointee to the bench, he found Matthew Martin of Santa Fe, New Mexico, not guilty on all counts. He was acquitted on each of the 4 misdemeanor accounts of trespassing and disorderly conduct. Martin was arrested a year ago and charged with entering and remaining in a restricted building. He was charged with disorderly conduct in a restricted building, violent entry, and parading in the Capitol building. Taking the stand in his own defense, Martin testified that he was indeed, quote, waved into the building by Capitol Police. Now, you may not know this, but it was confirmed during the trial that that is exactly what happened. An official for U.S. Capitol Police did indeed testify that police were, quote, so vastly outnumbered and couldn't stop people, and all they could do was observe and try to make sure no one got hurt. And so for some reason, police thought waving people into the Capitol building would contribute to that. Isn't that interesting? This whole January 6th episode, frankly, it's getting more and more interesting by the day, or by the trial, as it were. And of course, based on this testimony as well as surveillance video, the judge in this case agreed that the defendant proved that he was indeed waved in, invited into the building by police officials. And so obviously, this defeat was a stunning humiliation for the Justice Department that is increasingly being faced with indisputable evidence that there was far more to the situation than just protesters getting out of hand. In fact, a number of the trials scheduled for the upcoming weeks and months are for defendants charged with the very same things as Martin, which may mean that we're looking at just the beginning of the DOJ's acquittal humiliation. At the very least, it's being determined that the riot in the Capitol building was at least in some ways a self-inflicted wound. And of course, Tucker Carlson has been arguing that there is significant evidence that intelligence officials helped to stage the riot, a claim that the left-wing media has unilaterally and unanimously dismissed, which of course is no surprise. But interestingly, the legacy media has yet to contend with the recently released bombshell hidden camera footage of Matthew Rosenberg, who's the national security correspondent for the New York Times, who admitted to Veritas's hidden camera that there were, quote, tons of FBI informants among the people who attacked the Capitol. Now, that observation is rather fascinating, to say the least, because when you scour the New York Times coverage of January 6th, they don't seem to take too kindly to that notion that there were FBI informants on the Capitol grounds. For example, look at this headline. A January 6th panel seeks to debunk unfounded theory about FBI role in riot. Or this one, no, there's no evidence that the FBI organized a Capitol riot. Now, that appears to be nothing less than par for the course when it comes to the New York Times. Their reporters say one thing in private, all the while reporting its exact opposite to the public on the other. So, for example, Rosenberg privately ranted about the fact that the media's obsession with the January 6th event was utterly ridiculous. It was totally over the top. And he said he was absolutely over the establishment narrative that this was the single worst attack on America since 9/11, all that kind of hyperbole. And Rosenberg admitted that the New York Times coverage of the January 6th riots has simply not been accurate. It's not been reliable, and they've consistently published a false narrative to their readers. And yet, that didn't stop Rosenberg from writing an article, I kid you not, debunking the so-called big lie that January 6th was no big deal and that its significance was largely a fabrication of the left. Even though in private he said precisely those two things. It was not that big of a deal, and the left most certainly has overblown its significance. How ironic that the article he wrote is entitled The Next Big Lies. So,
because the flag still stands for freedom, and they can't take that away.